all liquored up here.
Yeah, we talk about Russia. We have to. To get into English. It's a subject.
Okay, I think you can all tell that I'm not Peter Bessot. I'm Metta Spencer, and Peter Bessot wasn't able to come. So I decided to step in and talk about work that I've been interested in doing. I'm interested in Russia's development. Thank you, Shabir, appreciate that. And especially with regard to both peace and democracy. I'll start off by giving you what I call the takeaways, what I hope to really say the bottom line, two things I want to make, 2 points I want to make in this talk. Number one is that civil society relationships, especially transnational ones, are important both for the sake of promoting peace and democracy. The second point is that civil resistance from the bottom up is the most promising way to get democracy, but that Russia's history, more than some others, has impaired its people's ability to use this approach. There is a widespread belief in Russia that change can only come from the top, and this notion, I think, disempowers people. Okay, I started going to Russia in 1982 as a guest of the Soviet Peace Committee because they were hosting East-West peace dialogues. And I continued going almost every year for many years, 30 years, except I was expelled for 5 years for hanging out with dissidents. And I've had some health problems that kept me away for a while, but I was there most recently in May. I usually stay with friends, and my friends come and stay with me in Toronto, and we phone each other, and I read daily reports from Russia, so I'm sort of current. I published my book, The Russian Quest for Peace and Democracy, 2 years ago, but now I'm writing an epilogue for it because I want it to be published in Russia, in Russian, and I want it to cover the democratization campaign and movement that started last winter. Now, I'll start from about 1982, when I started going there. At that time, the Soviet Union had a population of about 270 million, including 20 million members of the Communist Party. There were significant differences, I discovered, among the CPSU officials. I would be sitting at a table with a bunch of other people, and these were high-level officials. I was surprised that anybody wanted to talk to the likes of me, but they had people like the editor of Pravda, really official, important guys. And I would say something like, it would be very helpful for this disarmament negotiations that are going on now about nuclear weapons if the Westerners didn't have to be so concerned about human rights in Russia. The fact that there are abuses of dissidents means that it makes it a problem for negotiating weapons reductions. Well, at the table, these guys would give me some canned response. I knew exactly what they were going to say. They always said the same thing. But at coffee break, they would come up to me, yeah, that's what you were going to say. Keep going, that's just what we want to hear. Okay. And so here there were...
This is Brezhnev's time.
I'm sorry?
This is Brezhnev's time.
This was still Brezhnev's time. Yeah, late Brezhnev's time, because there was a period of a drop-off for a while, etc. But this was still Brezhnev time. And I had trouble understanding this difference between the backstage and the onstage. But of course I could tell pretty quickly that they weren't all like that, because I got expelled. The ones who didn't like me kicked me out of the country. Well, while I was there, I would always make a point to go see the dissidents, because I figured those were the guys who were really parallels to us. They were independent peace activists that were not being approved by the government or whatever. And so I quickly not quickly, a long time took me, to create kind of a typology of the Russian public opinion on issues having to do with peace and conflict. There were, the vast majority of Russians were what I would call sheep, you know. Yeah, they go along, they don't argue, they don't try to cause trouble.
They've been breeded this way.
Well, of course. I mean, they may in fact have preferred to some extent some other system, but if so, they didn't talk about it much. And then there were these people that I call termites, because these were about 1 million of the CPSU members were of the kind that clearly were working for reforms, but they did it within the party. They did it very discreetly, very politely, very quietly. And I would say there were about 1 million of those and about 20, or say 19 million of the party members who were not really reformists. They probably wanted things to keep going. And of course the KGB would be in the same category. Then these people that I used to go see, the dissidents, I got to calling them barking dogs. Because they had, of course, no power. In fact, they were often sent to prison or beaten up in the streets and so on. But they kept going, and they tried to make, they couldn't bite, but because they had no power, but they believed in making a lot of noise and trying to wake people up. So I called them barking dogs. And there were only a few hundred of those people. The regime could ignore them. And there was almost nobody.
They've been in prisons.
I'm sorry?
A lot of them been in prisons. Those dissidents, prisons,
Yeah, oh yeah, they went to prison, yeah.
in camps.
Yeah,
Whatever.
or they get beaten up, or in one case I phoned somebody and therefore their phone was taken out because I called them. So it was the kind of thing that was not nice, but they nevertheless had contacts with Westerners. Now, the amazing thing was the difference between the termites and the barking dogs, because they both wanted the same things. As far as I could tell, they agreed on substance for their goals, peace and democracy, and I don't know, some kind of economic change too, which was pretty vague, but at any rate, they didn't disagree, whatever, on anything except one point, and that was how they were going to get this change. The barking dogs believed that it had to come from the grassroots, it had to come from the bottom up. It had to be a mass movement of people just resisting the party. But the termites believed that you couldn't do it that way. You had to wait until you had one really good guy at the top of the party, and then he could bring in reforms. So they were planning and hoping and waiting for that to happen. And there came Gorbachev. Sure enough, he was their guy. So this is interesting that the termites and the barking dogs hated each other. And I have to say, I think that was the main, from my point of view, the main reason for the downfall of the Soviet Union and Gorbachev's failure, was that these people just couldn't stand each other, and they never did come to terms with each other. I'll speak
Also
more.
those who did not want change at all.
These others didn't want change, yeah. Okay, now, the barking dogs included a bunch of people. You know, Sakharov would be obviously the main one, Solzhenitsyn, the Moscow-Helsinki group, and I used to go see a group of people called Trust Builders. They hated each other. The barking dogs saw the termites as a privileged bunch of cowards. In fact, they would call them whores, people who were trying to make their way through the system by disguising their true values. And the termites had no more use for the barking dogs. They considered them naive extremists who were incapable of compromise. So there never was a rapprochement there. At first, there were very few barking dogs, but as Gorbachev began to give more democracy and more freedom and glasnost to people, they began to grow in numbers. Well, actually, the original ones mostly left the country, but they attracted a bunch of other people and became the ones who actually won public support, and even attracted, finally, Gorbachev's own base, the termites, but that's a different story. I'll come to that. very few Russian Soviet citizens could travel abroad. And it's not therefore too surprising that historically Russians have a strain of xenophobia, a little bit afraid of foreigners, and are historically mistrustful. They tend not to join NGOs. There are very few civil society organizations. Now, there were organizations during the Soviet time, but these were controlled by the state. They were not independent voluntary organizations. So that is what makes a state totalitarian, basically, is if they control the organizations. And naturally, a lot of people didn't want to belong to these. They were more or less forced to, but later on, that may partly explain why they're not keen on independent civil society organizations, and still don't have as many as we would. By civil society organizations, I mean anything in between the level of the state and the family. So we're talking about churches, universities, trade unions, clubs, Science for Peace, golfing associations, professional associations, and so on, that kind of thing, civil society. Now, the reformists, both the Termites and the Barking Dogs, did have contact with foreigners. In fact, that's where they got a lot of their ideas. They were very open to foreign ideas at the time. And one of the main places where they got stimulating ideas was in Prague. A number of people, of Russians, spent time in Prague because there was a magazine called Problems of Peace and Socialism, which was based in Prague. It was supported by the Soviet Union, but there were members of all the communist parties in the world that were sent there. And they were free to discuss anything they wanted and read anything they wanted. It was, people told me this was like a whole new university education, just spending a few years on the staff of this magazine. So they got great ideas there. Now, they didn't hang out too much with the Czech dissidents, because there were Czechs at the time, of course, because there was a Prague Spring. And here's where Gorbachev got some of his thoughts. Excuse me. He had, when he was at university, he had a roommate named Zdeněk Mlynář, a Czech studying law, and they were each other's best friends for life, although they couldn't see each other for many years. And they talked, and they actually had shared ideas that were pretty much in favor of social democracy. There was a book called Conversations with Gorbachev that's based on tapes they made of their conversation many years later, as they recalled their time together and what had happened in the meantime as they worked apart. Mlynář soon became, when he went back to Prague, he became one of the leading figures in the Prague Spring. And he, in fact, wrote the document for the Prague Spring. But his friend, Gorbachev, did nothing to protect him, did nothing in favor of the Prague Spring. And he, in fact, went to Prague a few months later. He was sent there on business. At that point, he said he believed that it was right for the Soviets to crush the Prague Spring.
1968.
I'm sorry, I can't remember dates very well. And he could, probably, you're right. Anyway, but when he got there, he wasn't allowed to see his old friend, who'd been sacked from his job. And he found that he would go into a factory and all the people, the Czechs, would stand up and turn their backs on him. They clearly did not like what had been done. And that made him begin to rethink what had happened. Anyway, the Prague Spring was very influential. And in my opinion, I think what he did many years later was, I think he was probably trying to make amends for what he had failed to do in favor of his friend by creating a Moscow Spring, which would be a vindication of his friend's ideas. But I've never heard him say that or anybody else say that. So I cooked that up. Now, there were transnational civil society organizations throughout the Cold War that were very influential and a source of the changes that actually Gorbachev adopted, which reduced the Cold War. For example, there's Pugwash, and in my book I show the history of how some of these organizations had influence. The Pugwash people had influence that resulted in the ABM Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. The IPPNW, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, headed by Bernard Lown and his colleague Yevgeny Chazov, induced Gorbachev to adopt a moratorium on nuclear weapons testing and to prolong it. There were a number of scientists going back and forth. For example, von Hippel from Princeton had a really close working relationship with Yevgeny Velikov, who was Gorbachev's science advisor. And they got together and did work on their respective weapons. They could actually share a lot about what they were discovering in weapons development. Parliamentarians Global Action, a group of parliamentarians around the world, set up seismic monitoring stations at the testing sites in Kazakhstan. With the support and permission of Gorbachev, they were able to induce him to agree to this. So this is the kind of thing that these organizations did. Most of these people were quite elite. It was not something that ordinary people could participate in, although there were quite a few of the physicians in the doctors' movement. Mostly, though, these people were very high-level people. To be able to travel abroad and to meet each other and discuss things.
Velikov was a physicist. I met him in Sweden.
Did you? Yeah. Interesting man. I interviewed him once. In fact, I interviewed 200 or so people, and I've put these transcripts and a lot of the voice recordings for the interviews on my webpage. And this is the address of the webpage. So if you want to go actually read or listen to those interviews, you're welcome to do so. I don't expect to ever use them again. Okay, now when we talk about democracy, the main theories about how to promote democracy hinge on the notion of building what is called social capital. That is, by forming relationships in civil society organizations, you tend to create trust and a list of friends that you can call on. You can take your petition around and expect that they will sign it. Or if you want to call a rally, maybe you've got a list of people that you can get to come, and so on. So if you want to have any social power at all, you need the help of other people. And that means you need trusting relationships. And the best way to build trusting relationships with a large number of people is through these civil society organizations. The main theorist of democracy on this issue is a guy named Robert Putnam at Harvard, who points out that there are two kinds of social capital. One he calls bonding social capital, and that is the sort of trust that is built up within specific groups of people who have much in common. They agree or they are similar in their backgrounds and interests, and it's easy to get along with them because you understand each other. This is the most normal thing. People prefer to hang out with people like themselves. They don't have to disagree or work out issues. The other kind, though, is bridging social capital. You could have a whole bunch of different networks that are quite separate, and then you'll have some people that belong to several, so that they kind of link up to separate networks or social groupings. And this bridging social capital, the kind of trust that you develop through this bridging of separate groups, is particularly important for developing democracy. It's a way of creating open-mindedness, the capacity for dealing with diversity and disagreements and so on. And that is necessary. Now, the beauty about transnational civil society organizations is that they're inherently bridging organizations. You're talking about people from completely different cultures and societies, and there are issues that come up. You disagree sometimes, and you have to work it out. So this is, to my mind, transnational civil society organizations are extremely important, and I really want to encourage them.
People-to-people democracy.
Yes. Now, there are historical reasons for the fact that Russians tend to have lower levels of trust between themselves than many other societies. It can be traced back to what my friend Helmut Bennett calls the peer keep system. Long ago, in Tsarist days, there was a tendency for people to try to run away. People might there was a lot of land out there, you could go hide if you wanted to get away. So it was not difficult for people to escape. But the people in authority, the landlords or the lords, wanted to keep them tied to the land. And so they developed a system whereby people had to tell on each other. If I knew that you were going to run away, or I had heard that you were probably going to run away, and I didn't tell on you, you're my neighbor, and I didn't tell that you're going to run away, then you run away, then I'm going to be punished the same as you would be. So you don't dare trust me. You don't dare tell me what you're planning to do, because you know it's not, it's contrary to my own interest.
Collective responsibility.
Yeah, because I have to protect myself, I have to tell on you, I have to denounce you. Now, that is precisely the kind of situation that breaks down trust in any society. And it continued under the totalitarian system. Of course, people were supposed to tell on each other. And it makes it difficult to develop really close, friendly relationships, trust among people that you don't know well. You'd have to only trust a few intimate friends, your family, maybe a couple of friends, that's about it. Because the rest of the people you've got to be careful about, and that still tends to be the case. Now I want to talk about Gorbachev's plan. When he came to power, he of course was a big-time termite, a consummate termite. He had been a social democrat most of his career, although he certainly didn't let people know about it. He kept it to himself. And he was quite aware that he wanted to introduce big changes, but there would be very strong polarized disagreements between the reformists who wanted change and the dinosaurs, as I call them, the people in power who wanted to prevent radical change. And his job was to try to move the whole thing forward while keeping these guys from going into a civil war. You know, he was not sure what might happen. So the idea was to try to keep them together as long as possible and move forward cautiously. So he was a bit cautious. And he realized that the dinosaurs could throw him out of the party, get rid of him. But he immediately started to work. Most Russians don't know this. The truth is, within months after he took power, he formed a committee of good people, his termites, and he told them to start to work on creating a new constitution, a really democratic constitution, which would not have any special role for the Communist Party.
And also anti-alcohol.
Yeah, I did that too.
It's very famous.
Yeah. But the main thing was that people don't realize he actually was very quickly at work trying to democratize the society and change Soviet Union into a democratic type of society. He gradually relaxed authoritarian rules. He encouraged civil society, which began to flourish. He encouraged free criticism, even of himself. He created a new parliament, the Congress of People's Deputies, and so on. It was really a big change going on. He also adopted, as far as ending the Cold War goes, he had something he called new political thinking, which was 4 different principles that he learned from foreigners and that turned out to be extremely important in my opinion. Number 1 was what he called common security or mutual security. The notion that we make ourselves more secure not by weakening our opponents, but by making them more secure too. The second, goes contrary to everything that we had always believed, right? Number 2, the concept of reasonable sufficiency, that there is no need to balance the forces of the East and West, because once you have a certain amount of capacity, military force, you can do the job, you have enough. And so the other guy, if they have 10 times as much, it doesn't matter, because you've got enough. You can't kill anybody 20 times over. Enough is enough is enough is enough. So he didn't worry about parity to the same degree as people before, military people always did. Number 3 is the notion of non-offensive defense or non-provocative defense. This was the notion that a state should limit itself to short-range weapons. And this was to reassure any potential enemy that we can defend our own territory. Don't you come in here because we're ready to take care of ourselves. But you can trust that we're not going to attack you because our weapons can't go beyond our own borders. They're short-range weapons. So we have no capacity to project power into your territory. So don't worry. This reassures you, and we only can defend ourselves. This was a source of factor ending the Cold War. And number 4 was the notion of unilateral initiatives. That is, instead of having to negotiate a treaty where you spend years and years and years making sure that everybody's giving up just the same amount, etc., you have what he calls unilateral initiatives. One side can break an impasse by just taking a step and then saying, now would you like to reciprocate? You want to take a step back too. And I'll take another step and you take another step and we will back out of this situation. He did that several times. For example, the moratorium on nuclear testing was something that he did unilaterally. He just did it. He took the troops out of Eastern Europe. He just did it. He said, I'm not going to impose communism on Eastern European countries. Didn't have to make that step, but he just did it. And he hoped that the other people would reciprocate in turn. They didn't always do it.
What did you call it? Unilateral, what was it?
Unilateral initiatives. Mm-hmm. Okay, now those are just 4 things, but they made a big difference. As democracy increased under Gorbachev, criticism also increased. And then you got Yeltsin on the scene, who pretended to be more democratic than Gorbachev himself. And a lot of people now were kind of sorry they hadn't been barking dogs, and they wish they had, and now they'd like to make up for it, by becoming more radical as Democrats than anybody else. So you had the movement, a new movement. It was quite a mass movement called Democratic Russia, composed largely of Moscow intelligentsia. They were the successors to the barking dogs, and there were plenty of them. And they followed Yeltsin. They thought he was really terrific. Gorbachev was running into all kinds of problems. With the economy, which I don't think anybody could have made an easy transition to a capitalist economy. And ethnic nationalism, which increased. Both of these made life miserable as he was trying to change the system. The radical Democrats began to gain power under Sakharov's leadership. They seemed to believe that Gorbachev could do anything he pleased. So if he didn't take stronger actions just because he didn't want to. He was a weakling, or he was half-hearted about his reforms. And so they thought that he could do anything, and they blamed him for not being more assertive. He, in fact, knew that the dinosaurs still could oust him from the party.
He was very limited.
Yeah, and he couldn't do anything. And for example, the radical Democrats, these Democratic Russia, as they call themselves, wanted to abolish the party. He, on the other hand, wanted to simply make it one of many different political parties, and it wouldn't have any more power or authority over the government than any other party. He set you might say, a time bomb. He started creating this new Union Treaty, which was going to supplant the previous constitution of the Soviet Union, and it was supported by most people. There were polls and referenda, and most people.
This little tricky question.
Well, we can talk about it later. He had a lot of support at that point, and for this new Union Treaty, which then would have no special role for the party, and that would be the end of the dinosaurs.
Not so fast.
However, he was spared in the meantime. He had reason to be afraid because the dinosaurs could still sack him. And in the winter of 1990-91, he was worried that he was going to lose his position before he could get this new Union Treaty in and before he could get his reforms really institutionalized. So he shuffled his cabinet. And I think this really amounted to an invisible coup. I think some thugs, military thugs particularly, had him by the throat. And he had to do something to placate them, at least temporarily. But when he did so, he gave them some jobs that had previously belonged to the Termites, his friends and his base. And this really offended his base. And they began to desert him in droves. They couldn't understand why he would do a thing like that. And they quit. They went over to Yeltsin and his Democratic Russia movement. So the entire progressive intelligentsia joined Yeltsin in just a matter of months. They have never changed their minds, by the way. If you talk to any Russians, almost all of them think poorly of Gorbachev. Anyway, in August, there in fact was a coup from the right. The dinosaurs did have a putsch, which failed. And there was a nonviolent defense of the White House, which is the Russian parliament. But these people were there not for the sake of preserving Gorbachev, but to protect Yeltsin. And then, just 3 months later, Yeltsin made a coup of his own from the left, and that succeeded. He simply got a couple of other heads of republics together with him in a bathhouse, and they got sloshed, and wrote documents saying that they were seceding from the Soviet Union. That was the end of the Soviet Union, and where Yeltsin was the president of the Republic Russia, Gorbachev was the president of the Soviet Union, and since there was no more Soviet Union left, Gorbachev was out of a job. Now, as for I'm going to swiftly race through the Yeltsin years, which lasted from 1990 to 99. He was an alcoholic, he was sick a lot, he had no plans, and the place was chaotic. People look back on that period as a terrible period. He was certainly no Democrat. He wanted to create a constitution that would give himself all the power. And when Parliament refused to cooperate with him, he shelled them, killing what may have been 1,000 people. Nobody will ever know how many people were killed as he shelled them. his elections were fraudulent, and in fact, everybody believed that he was a Democrat. They'd never seen a Democrat before, but here he was, and that gave democracy a bad name. They still haven't quite gotten over that. His approval ratings fell to 5% at the end of his 2 terms in office. At that point, he handed power over to Putin. But as he was doing this, Putin was not a well-known person at all, and it was very questionable whether Putin would be elected, because he did have to be elected somehow. Even if the elections were fraudulent, he had to be elected. So there's...
He was KGB guy.
He was. And there was a remarkable provocation created over Chechnya. People clearly connected or under the authorization of the government, somebody in the government, went around blowing up apartment buildings in Moscow and another nearby city. I read this book detailing enormous details about it by Alexander Litvinenko and Yuri Felshtinsky. But there's a more recent book that you might want to trace down. I think the current issue of the New York Review of Books has a review by Amy Knight, I believe, of a new book which reaches the same conclusion, that this was clearly done by somebody in the government with the authorization of the FSB, which is the successor to the KGB.
To scare people.
And it was done so they could put the blame on Chechens, so they could go to war with Chechnya and give a justification for this war, which would give weight to Putin's candidacy and enable him to be elected.
Strong.
Well, he certainly was elected, and he did, from some points of view, a bang-up job. He enjoyed, most of the time, popularity ratings of 70% or higher. Most of that was because of the price of oil. World price of oil went up. And Russia is the second highest producer of oil in the world. Under Gorbachev, oil had fallen to the price of $7 a barrel at one point. Under Putin, it reached $147 a barrel. So he had a lot of money to play with, and he was able to improve the standard of living of most Russians very well. They drive cars, they are very satisfied. Anything that brings their standard of living up, obviously, is going to be popular.
Especially in Moscow.
There's less freedom of press, of course. Journalists are always getting killed for telling too much of the truth. And he was scared out of his wits when the color revolutions began to happen around the former Soviet space, in Serbia, in Georgia, in Ukraine, in other places to a lesser extent. And he immediately began to try to control civil society. That meant he made all civil society organizations go through intense inspection of their books constantly, and he created gongos. Instead of NGOs, he created GONGOs, government-organized NGOs, that is, groups that were run by the government, just as always happens in a totalitarian regime. He brought, by the end of his second term, there was a question whether he would retire or not, because the Constitution said he should only serve 2 terms. And he did bring in Medvedev, who had been the deputy prime minister and who took power as the president, while Putin himself took a back seat, so to speak, as prime minister. Their prime minister is not the same as ours. That is, it's not nearly as powerful a role. It's appointed by the president, and he can sack them anytime he wants. So the president is really the powerful role. But Medvedev sounds good. He really talks like a liberal Democrat. And anyone in this room, I'm sure, would rather vote for him than for Putin if we had a choice.
Except they agreed that after his term, he will give it back to Putin.
Wait, get there. Okay, indeed, after 4 years, he announced that he would, he and Medvedev would trade jobs again, more or less. He would become president. And there were parliamentary elections, which were grossly fraudulent. Everybody could see that. And so protests began, and they lasted all winter. Putin's popularity plummeted, especially among what's called the creative class. These are the young, educated, urban professionals. They really dislike him. At one of their rallies in the middle of the winter, there were 100,000 protesters present. But he did not, all they wanted was to oust him and to get new fair elections. But this did not happen. And he stood his ground and took office. And I was there at that time. It was interesting to watch his inauguration, compare it with Obama's inauguration, because he drove up through the city streets of Moscow that had been cleared. There were no people anywhere in sight. There were no cars. There wasn't even a dog. You couldn't see anybody in these streets. And then he goes into this wonderful palatial room, looks like a solid gold room, and takes his oath of office and becomes president again for the third term. You could only compare that to Obama's, where he was walking through the streets with a million people. Okay, his third term, I don't want to belabor this, but it has not been a good hopeful beginning if you're interested in democracy. He began to crack down immediately. One of the most objectionable new laws says that all NGOs that accept any money from abroad must register themselves as foreign agents, which means spies. Well, all of these organizations accept money from abroad because it's businesses in Russia would be afraid to give money. They don't anyway, and there's no tradition of supporting NGOs. Of course, Khodorkovsky is a good example. Somebody who would wind up in jail for long years if he supported things that Putin didn't like. Well, at the moment, most of the human rights organizations are being shut down, or on the verge of being shut down, because they refuse to register themselves as foreign agents. They say they're certainly not that, and they will be closed down. Leaders of the opposition movement are being arrested and jailed, and new laws have been enacted that impose heavy fines for violating any rules at rallies. There's also a new law to censor the internet. In the first terms of Putin's, the one thing, the TV was censored, the press was pretty much censored, at least self-censored, but at least the internet was pretty free. But it's a question now how long that's going to continue, because they passed a law saying that any programming or any websites that show child pornography or promote suicide or the use of drugs, these can be shut down. So they've set up the equipment now for shutting down websites. And in fact, they immediately did shut down YouTube, at least briefly. So it's not a good sign. Nobody knows how much longer the free internet will be available. And you've probably all heard about Pussy Riot. There were 3 young women who put on a very tasteless performance in Mastro's Cathedral, mainland, and they were arrested and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Putin has shut down various foreign organizations that were trying to promote the spread of democracy, and so on. The things are not looking good. On the other hand, the opposition has not given up. They have formed a coordinating council to continue pressing for reforms. And they held an election by the internet recently. They hoped that 500,000 Russians would vote for this. I think there are about 40 or 45 members of this coordinating council, which will continue to orchestrate opposition to Putin's regime. They were looking for 500,000 people to vote, but only 82,000 or so actually voted, which is not a great turnout. Okay, say you're concerned about how to get democracy. There's a book by Chenoweth and Stefan, which I'm actually it'll be covered in the upcoming issue of Peace Magazine. They did a study of about over 250 different campaigns that were conducted over the last number of years, I've forgotten just how many, around the world to try to oust a government or change it. And they found that about half of the campaigns to resist a government were nonviolent. They were civil resistance campaigns. Now these campaigns, civil resistance, were twice as successful as the violent campaigns. And they were far more likely to be a democracy 5 years later than campaigns that had used violence.
I think it's 52-26% actually, because I was at a lecture a few months ago when they brought that up, that the non-violent protests by, I think it's 52%, actually achieved that they wanted to, and only 26% of the violent ones did. It's quite interesting.
That's what the Bible says, right? Don't hurt thy neighbor and you will be better off.
Well, I have it on my Kindle, and I should have copied down all these figures. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I was at an Islamic thing and they were talking about it, and they were talking about different things in the Arabic word and that. It was, I can't remember the lecture, but it was really interesting that this point came out. So, you know, it just proves violence doesn't work.
Right. Well, it's certainly more
Be interested,
successful.
sorry, if I may just quickly, be interested to have not now, but another time, a discussion on where you have to actually stop being non-aggressive.
Yeah, look at Gandhi, right? How he gained independence for India.
But what point, where's that trip line where violence becomes necessary?
Necessary? I don't know about necessary. You can always quit before, rather than resort to violence.
That's why, you know,
I mean,
just
people
discussion
assumed
around
that there was the logic of people would only use violence if it became, so to speak, necessary.
Yeah.
Now, in fact, some organizations or some bodies stick to nonviolence no matter what, and they're far more likely to succeed than the ones that resort to violence.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Sorry for interrupting.
now one of the other questions that they asked was, how come? Why are nonviolent civil resistance movements more successful? The answer seems to be numbers. How many people you can bring out to participate in your movement. You need lots and lots of people. So if you succeed in bringing large numbers out, you have a very much better chance of winning, and also of becoming a democracy. And the reason nonviolence works is people are more willing to participate in nonviolent campaigns than if they know that something violent may happen.
But Metta, violence works too. French Revolution wasn't non-violent.
If violence sometimes works, but the rates that they found
Chances are better.
are much better. If
Because in non-violence you get families and kids coming along, you see.
Yeah.
because you get people believe in democracy and they think my child's got to be involved in this.
I think it's
But
better.
when it's totally non-violent, they bring them along and you
It's
suddenly get this critical mass.
Okay, now most most movements that to create a democracy or to change a regime are unpredicted. Everybody gets surprised. 1989, communism just fell. Boom, almost totally non-violently. Nobody expected that. The Arab Spring, nobody expected that, and so on. Now, what is interesting is, why is it unpredictable? Okay, there's a guy named Solomon Asch who many years ago did an experiment. He would get 6 people together, and 5 of them would be stooges of his, trained. Only the 6th one is the real subject of the experiment. He would show them 2 lines, I don't know, A and B. And he would start at the beginning and ask, which is longer, A or B? Anybody could see, but he had trained he'd got these people to agree that they. So the first guy says, A is longer. And the second person says, A is longer. The third says, A is longer. The fourth says, A is longer. And then you get to number 6. What's he going to say?
Confirm.
He's going to say A is longer. In the majority of cases, that's what happens. People will go along with, maybe they don't know what the hell is going on, maybe they're wondering, but they don't tell the truth. They don't want the embarrassment of being different from the rest of the people around them. Now that's what a guy named Timur Kuran calls preference falsification. And we falsify our preferences all the time, just, you ask, you ask me, do I like your new suit? And I think it's the stupidest looking outfit I ever saw, but I say, oh great, it's just politeness.
Especially important for marital relations.
Maybe. But what is clear is that you can also have your preferences falsified because you live in a totalitarian regime or an authoritarian regime where you'll be punished if you say the wrong thing. Now the question is, you can have a society in which everybody prefers something else, but they each think that the penalties are going to be so heavy if they express their true preferences, or if they'll be ridiculed by other people if they express, because everybody else seems to be going along with it, so they don't want to put. So you can get a whole society of people who are not telling the truth about what they really believe and want. Now that's how authoritarianism works. That's how you get a totalitarian regime.
Is that the emperor's new clothes?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now there is a certain cost to that. You sort of lose self-respect, when you're falsifying your preferences in public all the time. You have the sense of, you're a liar, and there's a sense of shame, and there's some discomfort in constantly pretending to be something other than the way you are. It's an internal psychological state. And when the situation changes such that the actual penalties that are in the world that are going to happen to you for telling the truth seem to be diminishing, and you might get away with it, or at least the penalties are not very severe, but your internal discomfort is still high, the balance is the ratio between this internal pain or discomfort and the external expected pain that that changes things. There's a threshold at which point you say, I think I can get away with saying this, or at least I'm willing to pay the price. I don't want to keep my mouth shut anymore. You stand up and you say the truth. That's a threshold. Now, people differ in where their thresholds lie. Some people are hot-headed, strong sense of integrity, strong sense of I have to tell the truth. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. So I'm going to tell you that your suit is the ugliest thing I ever saw. You know, that might be what I would do if I were that kind of person. So some people have is that a low threshold or a high threshold? I don't know which it is, but the threshold for those people means that they're going to be the first ones to become dissidents. They're going to speak up no matter what.
A level of integrity.
And then there are some people who aren't going to be first, but if you go first, I'll back you up. So I'll be second. And then there's somebody who will be third, and so on. So it's like a row of dominoes. Yeah.
Depends on how secure your conviction is, because if you take those two lines, I mean, who can not speak the truth?
A lot of people. Experimentally, you'll find a lot of people will tell them, say what other people are saying.
No matter what the penalty is, no matter if there's a penalty or not, because obviously.
That's right. In that case, it's just social pressure, or what they think of as conformity. And there must be something wrong with me if I think that I don't understand it, but I'm not going to argue with people. I'll say the same thing as everybody else.
Well, if the issues are flexible, I can see that, but with two lines, I don't see it.
Well, okay, I don't know how long these lines had to be, but the point is, it was clear that one was longer than the other. And that a lot of people, if not the majority, I've forgotten the numbers, but a high percentage of people actually falsified their own experiences. And this is, it's been well established, a long time.
It comes down to your own internal security. If you're secure within what you are as a human being, then you'll say the right thing. If you're not
Unless
secure,
you're going to go to prison for the rest of your life, in which case you shut up.
No, some people do it regardless. If they're really strong, they're really
Yeltsin went to prison, Some people did. And the dissidents, the barking dogs I went to see, were out there in the street doing things that got them arrested or beaten up.
Well,
And
scientists should stick to their honor and
Sure.
do it. Martin Luther, he said, "Here I am, I can't change it."
Yeah.
Yeah, you can.
And he was, his life was threatened, still said.
I think it may come to the fact that it becomes on your social, how insecure you are, but then if you getting arrested achieves nothing, then you might not say anything so that you still are in a position to do something when it comes to a point where you can actually add weight to resolving the problem. I think that might be another consideration with people sometimes.
Yeah, I'm sure. Okay, now here we have a situation that can catch fire. You can have a situation where one person does it and other people will follow, and the thresholds are different, but there's some people, it's a continuous, it's like a row of dominoes, all right? One sets it off and it goes and goes and goes. And in no time you have got rid of communism in Poland and East Germany and places like that. But the problem is, you don't know what the distribution of thresholds is in a population. You can't tell whether and how many people are going to follow you when you stick your neck out. And that makes it really unpredictable. There's just no way to know, because the majority, that a lot of people in this society are not expressing their true preferences, and that some of them are going to follow you, but will it be enough? You have to have large numbers to make it succeed. You don't know whether it's going to be. So suppose you have a row of dominoes in which there's a gap. You get it going, and then nothing happens. It stops because there's some missing people who should keep it moving and join in, and they don't. And I think that that's the situation in Russia. I know that there are, I mean, you say you went to opposition movements.
Yeah.
Great, I went to those too. I went to the Occupy Abai camp in the park, and I interviewed people there and so on, and I could see there were quite a few people who would show up in Moscow at these opposition rallies. Not enough, at least not yet. And do I think that they're going to? I'm not so sure. I think there are gaps. For one thing, Putin is a smart man. He has learned how to control the situation. He's doing all the things that will make it more difficult for people to communicate with each other and see who's going to be willing to go out if I go out, you know. So I think that is he's on top of the situation and is able to spoil the mechanisms by which people can check each other out and communicate. And then they don't have as many NGOs as we would have. So they don't have the opportunity to check out things very much. Still, I think there's more to it than that. When I look at the gap in the row of dominoes, I mean, I know people who belong in that gap. They're friends of mine, and I mean, I don't want to say anything bad about them because I love them. These are dear friends. But I am going to say something that they probably wouldn't appreciate. Several things. I think they're very passive. They don't trust any politician. They don't trust Putin, but they also don't trust any of the people in the opposition. Some of these people won't vote, period, because they don't trust any politician or any opposition leader anywhere. And this lack of trust is a serious thing, I think. And we need more civil society organizations there that will help them to build trust. But more than that, there's a psychological passivity to some extent. I went around years ago saying to people that I didn't understand their attitude toward Gorbachev. If I were locked up in a prison and a warden came and unlocked the door and let me out, I would thank him. They didn't thank Gorbachev. And I didn't understand why they weren't grateful. Why would they not thank Gorbachev for letting them out of prison? You know, you let them have their freedom. Well, to some extent, I think the answer is they didn't want to be let out. Some of them didn't. I interviewed Lyudmila Alexeyeva, the leading dissident in Russia. She's 85 or 86 years old now. She was one of the founders of the Moscow-Helsinki group. And she said, well, people, you know, if he lets you out of prison, how are you going to take care of yourself? You've been in prison all your life. These people have been in prison 70 years. The government told them what to do. The government gave them their apartments, their jobs, etc. If I wanted a good apartment, I couldn't have one unless the government gave me one. People don't know how to take care of themselves. So it was a really threatening thing to be given freedom, and now you're responsible for taking care of yourself. They didn't know how to do it. They were like children, she said. We were like children.
Because the underpinning structure of a real democracy didn't exist, so democracy can't exist without those government structures that make democracy work. I was in a lecture last night, a very similar thing that they were saying. It was about Iran, actually, saying about, you know, how it was taken away so that democracy would fall apart. And it's just interesting hearing you say it, I can just see exactly why there's nothing to support democracy, so where the heck do we go?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I had to take it seriously. That sounded reasonable. If people didn't know how to take care of themselves, no wonder they didn't want to be let out of prison. They didn't know what to do. The problem is, that's not the only reason, because some of these people are younger people too. And they have spent 20 years now with a lot of freedom, growing up, and they know how to take care of themselves more or less. But they believe, by and large, that they don't make any difference, that what they do cannot really matter. They have this sense of powerlessness.
And
Mhm.
should we be concerned about that? I mean,
I am, but listen, there's some things about other people's lives that you have to be careful how you interfere with the way they think. I'm saying this about my friends, and I think I would offend them if they were here. They may see this, and they will be offended. So you have to think about the fact you can't dominate other people. And yes, I worry about
what
it.
we should be concerned about is, do they follow the international law, or do they violate it? Internally, I think we should give them the freedom to organize themselves as they
Well,
want.
I agree, and there are, they do belong to the European Court of, what's it called? There's a European Court of Human Rights, what's it called? You know? There's a court that actually has had a lot of influence on Russia because people take cases to it. I think it's in Strasbourg, but I'm not sure.
Yes, the European Court of Human Rights or something like that. Oh, gee, I can't remember exactly.
Yeah.
But the
And-
thing that you're saying, it's the same as Harper's doing here.
Yeah,
Which is the
yeah,
real frightening thing, because
They're
the
not
more
alone.
the more you don't listen, as Harper is, then the more people think, what's the point of voting? And you end up in the situation that you're on about here. So Canadians have got to wake up to where Harper is driving this country, because, my analogy is if you had 10 people out of 30 million voted, and 8 people voted for Harper, he'd say, I've got a majority, I've got an 80% majority. Sorry.
That's fine,
It's
okay.
frightening.
Now, I'm thinking now about these people who are in the gap, the domino gap, the friends of mine. One of them, I said, young man, I said, I think I can get you into a course that gives training in civil resistance, how to do a civil resistance movement. You would find this very interesting, and it would even help you with your work. He said, yeah, but I'd be blacklisted for going to it, so I don't dare go to a place where they would talk about that. Okay, I see that point. But then I pursue it, and I said, well, there must be some way for you to learn about civil resistance. And I'm told, well, we could read books if we wanted to, but we aren't interested. If we were interested, we could read books. Well, to me, that's not quite the same. You go to a meeting, you find out a lot that you wouldn't find out by reading a book. But nevertheless, it's true they could read books, and it's true that they're not interested. That's odd to me. Why aren't they interested? These are the people in the gap who are not going to be the dominoes that are going to fall.
you mean they can read any book they want in Russia now?
They have access to, they can go on Amazon.com and order any book you could order. No problem. They don't have any curiosity about nonviolent resistance. So if you don't have curiosity about it, to me that's puzzling, all right? I get puzzled.
Have you got an answer for that, or you just really, you don't know why they don't do it?
I spend a lot of time speculating. I even have a theory which is really going to offend.
But I'm surprised that they would have access to any book, because in Canada, there's a list of prohibited books.
You know, I think they can get anything they want.
But in Canada, we can't get it. There are lists, a long list actually of books that we're not allowed to.
Well, anyway, that's not the issue. The issue is they have no curiosity about it.
So what's your speculation?
Okay, I think there's a kind of passivity. What is freedom? Well, the first experience you have of freedom as a human being comes from your freedom to move freely. And freedom still is largely a matter of can you move your body any place you want. My friend Helga Bennett has a theory. She talks about what was called the table of ranks in Tsarist times. Everybody had a rank. It was like in the military. You had one rank or another. And your rank was a question of how far you were allowed to go without having prior permission to go someplace. High-ranking people could travel a fair bit. Serfs and people at the bottom couldn't travel. And that was the measure of your rank, how much you can go without prior permission. Russians still do something like that. They have a system of internal passports. You're supposed to be able to provide papers showing who you are, where you're allowed to be. And when you go to a different place, you must go to register yourself and within 3 days, make it clear to the government where you are. If you're staying in a hotel, they'll do that for you. When I was there in May though, I went with my host to the post office to register myself. And it took all morning, 4 hours, because she had to fill out stuff in Russian, and I can't do that. He did it for me, but it took ages. And all these people were there taking forever to do this, and nobody was complaining. Nobody acted as if there's anything annoying about this. I was told that what happens to these forms when you fill them out is they go to a warehouse someplace and nobody ever sees them again. There's no use for them. There's no value whatever in doing this, but you have to do it. Big deal if you don't. I thought this is a human rights violation. Making people account for their location wherever they go, that's an abuse.
Is there a use for it when it comes to searching for criminals?
I'm told that they put them in a warehouse and there's hardly ever any effort to try to find out what happened to those papers. Now, I had dinner with a woman who is on the President's Council for Civil Society and Human Rights. It's a body of people appointed by the President, a very high-level body. She can and does walk up to Medvedev, hand him a paper and say, please read this, Mr. President, and he will do it. So that's the kind of power this body has. So I mentioned to her, this is terrible that these people have to spend so much time registering their whereabouts for no good reason. And she said, well, maybe sometime we'll find a good reason for it. I don't know. She had no sense herself that there was any infringement on human rights to have to fill these forms out. I've talked to other people about it, and they say, well, the reason for it is everybody has to be registered because where you are registered, you have a right to be. And let's say somebody buys your apartment and you're registered there. They can't throw you out just because they bought it. They can't evict you because you're registered there. So if they got rid of the system of registration, the streets would be full of people who were homeless. My answer is, look, we have a housing market in every other country, and if you get evicted, you go find a place that you can afford, and if you can't afford any place, you move someplace else. That, the housing market takes care of itself. You don't need any help with that. But no, this is a sign to me that these are people who are used to having their physical movements constrained. Now why? Where did this come from? Okay, now I'm going to really stick my neck out and say that I sort of believe, in a very old discredited theory During World War II, there was this group of people, mostly anthropologists, who studied national character. And a guy named Jeffrey Gorer, working with Margaret Mead, wrote a book about the Russian national character. And he said that a lot can be explained to the fact that babies are all swaddled in Russia. Swaddling, you put the baby's legs straight out and his arms down to the side, and you wrap him up in such a way that he can't move. Can't move, can't bend his legs, can't move. And they stay that way. Of course, once in a while they take them out to change their diapers, I guess, and feed them. But basically they stay in this tight, constrained situation up to 2 years. Now, I think most nowadays they're probably not that long. It might be 6 months, I don't know. And they're not able to explore the world with their hands or, move. And Gorer said that Margaret Mead could tell which people had been swaddled. She said to somebody once, "Were you swaddled as a child?" And the person said yes, and he wanted to know how come. He said that their upper arms, they hold their arms tighter to the body than other people would. And if they move their lower arms, they don't move their upper arms too. So, and it's farther back. They hold their arms sort of farther back, and they tend to do gestures that are the same on both sides. And he said he got so that he could tell who'd been swaddled and who hadn't as they were adults. Well, this theory was so discredited that it put an end to the whole field of national character studies. It ended it. Everybody thought it was ridiculous, and I'm beginning to think it's not so ridiculous. So I went on Facebook, and I have 550 Facebook friends. So I found 50 of my Russian friends on Facebook, and I sent them a little questionnaire. Were you swaddled? And would you have your child swaddled? And what are your politics, and so on? Well, I could tell I knew enough about their politics, so I could pretty well tell if they were people who were in the opposition movement. And some people got mad at me. My dear friends got mad at me, said that was a rude question. It implied that, like Americans, I was criticizing them for their tradition and their culture. And they wouldn't answer the question. But some people actually answered and said, I don't know whether I was swaddled, I'll find out. Other people specifically said, I would never swaddle my child, never. Very emphatic about it. And those were the people who were in the opposition movement. So far, so good. Yeah, I think there's a connection. I think it has something to do with lack of the feeling you learn as a baby. Don't fight it. You cannot get out. You cannot get your freedom. Relax and take it easy, because you're not going to get out of here. And there's something of that stays with people, I think, to the point where they don't feel they could be in this row of dominoes that is willing to move, to act. Okay, this is just a crazy theory of mine, and I don't expect anybody to take it too seriously. I'm sort of believing it, but that's it. You asked, Helmut, should we try to help? Well, I wish I knew how, because, it's clear that the one thing that they don't want is to have foreigners come and tell them how to run their business. You can't sit people down and say, now I'm going to give you lessons in democracy. They don't want lessons in democracy, and I don't blame them. Who wants to be done that way? But there are cultural changes that are needed, and I can think of a couple of ways in which some people in the West or outside of Russia can contribute to that. I believe in storytelling, especially when it comes to cultural change. I've done a lot of work on soap operas, or I've read a lot and studied a lot about soap operas, because there are people who use soap operas as a way of changing public opinion on a whole bunch of issues. Things like how many children to have, or should you, HIV protection, have you?
Gay rights, abortion.
Yeah, gay rights, all kinds of things. And it has a big influence. Watching The West Wing, you get a sense of how a good democratic president of the US would function. And they would always, in The West Wing, they'd have some plot involving issues that were actually going on as real issues in the government, for the government to face. And they would show somebody actually solving the problem intelligently. It does influence public opinion. I think this could be done to teach people democracy. But it has to be, you can't just take something that would be in our society and put subtitles on it. It needs to be it has to be culturally specific. It has to be people speaking their own language, dressed in the way of the society itself, etc. Then they get influenced by that. So I think maybe you can't do that on Russian TV because Putin controls the TV. You couldn't put together a TV drama, a series of shows like The West Wing. But you might be able to on the internet. I'm not sure what's possible, but I think it would be expensive, but you could put it on outside and then show it, make it available to everybody in Russia, I think. And I'd like to see that happen. But the other part that is something we can do is the question of helping create more trust. There is a bridging social capital is very important, and transnational conversations actually are very useful in that regard. It's not as easy or as comfortable as talking to your own family. You actually do run into disagreements that you have to work out, etc. But it's now possible. Pugwash is not the thing it used to be. IPP&W is much less than it was, etc. E&D is less. These big transnational organizations that held and fostered transnational conversations during the 80s are not really available. And they were elite anyway. They weren't for the masses. But you can do it with Skype. You can do it with Google Plus is even better than Skype. You can form groups. I want to create something called the Global Pub, where I get Canadians to pick topics that they're interested in. So we'll have 4 Canadians sitting in front of a computer and 4 Russians sitting in front of a computer. And they agree to get together by Google Plus for an hour or 2 hours a month for 6 months and talk about whatever topic they chose to talk about. Nuclear weapons, climate change, whatever, military reform, whatever they're interested in. I don't care what they talk about. But any kind of conversation, and I call it a pub because I don't think it ought to be like a classroom, a formal seminar. I think it ought to be like people sitting in a pub having a conversation in a friendly way with people about topics that they find mutually interesting. And I think that if we do this on a huge scale, you know? If you have a church that has a similar church in, Krasnoyarsk, get in touch with them, set it up. Because one thing is that the Russians, high school kids are learning English. So you have to find people probably who speak English, because I don't know many of us who speak Russian. But it's possible to do. And to set up a regular conversation, sustained dialogue. The Russians can travel now, if they have the money, you know. They can go abroad. But going and lying on the beach in Turkey is not the same as having a sustained discussion over an issue that you find interesting. And that's what I think could be of value. Okay, I've taken longer than I should have. I've taken an hour and a half. I quit. Now we can have